Okay, we're here to change the lead nut on the P51 cam lift. Before we start, I'm going to give you an overview of what we're doing. We have a standard cam lift here. We're going to take off the wire connectors here on the top to remove all of our wiring. The wire typically goes through a loop here in the back. I've got this disconnected right now. We're going to get all this wiring out. We're going to remove the lower limit switch and get everything out of our way. Ultimately, we are going to disconnect this shaft from the motor with a simple screw here. We're going to remove this top plate. We're going to loosen the side panels, top and bottom, so they spread out a little bit. And we're going to push this up. We're going to take the lower carriage plate, the upper carriage plate, the face plate, and the lead screw off in one unit and put it on the bench. Again, we're just trying to replace this lead nut, which resides here. It's mounted to the bottom carriage plate on the cam lift. First thing we're going to do is we're going to disconnect the shaft from the motor. It's connected typically with one of these helical couplers, and there's two screws, one that grabs the shaft on the motor and one that tightens around the journal on the shaft here. That is a 3/32 inch hex wrench. This one has a different type of coupler. I'm going to change this lift over. This lift is in for a whole new lead screw. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen, first thing I'm going to do is come in here and I'm going to loosen the bottom screw that's retaining the shaft onto the motor via this coupler. So basically, if you're all using this coupler, you want to loosen this top screw. You don't have to loosen the other one on the motor. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen the screw that's on the top of your shaft here. On the very top of the lead screw, there's a quarter 20 that has a small, I think it's 5/32 inch hex wrench. Now, if you should be able to simply hold the lead screw with your hand, put the wrench on the screw, and then turn it counterclockwise. Remember, lefty loosey, righty tighty. Okay, so you want to turn it counterclockwise to take the screw completely out. If you can't hold this lead screw without turning in your hands, you can take a pair of pliers like this, but you want to put a rag over the lead screw and then your pliers so you don't tear it all up. Okay, just be careful whether you use rubber glove or whatever. The idea is to put some resistance on the lead screw. So I'm going to take this off. This has a quarter 20. It's typically a button head. Sometimes you have a cap screw on top. And this one has a washer on it, so it goes right like that. So that has been removed. I'm going to take these two bolts and loosen them. They hold the top plate onto the shafts. So all you have to do is loosen them. You don't have to remove them. Okay? Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this side loose. And the reason I want to take it loose is because you've got a limit switch right here, and you've got the limit switch striker right here. Because of the fact that we're going to move this whole carriage assembly up and out of the way, if we don't have this side pulled back, this striker is going to smash into our limit switch, and I guarantee you will break the limit switch. You don't want to do that. Rather than remove the limit switch or remove the striker, I'm just loosening the sides up so I can get it up and out of the way. So what I'll do, I'll just loosen these screws. These are coming out. And you can see it pulls away. I'm going to loosen the bottom screws too to give myself a little bit more flexibility on this one side. This would be the right side as you're looking at it. So now it gets it out of the way. Okay? Now the left side we don't have to really loosen the bottom, but we do have to remove the top. And by removing the top of this, it's going to allow us to remove this top plate. So what holds this top plate on are these two screws that bite into the uprights and the two screws on each side of the side plates. So now we should be able to just sort of wiggle that off, and there's a bearing in here that rests on the journal of the lead screw. So that goes aside. So now, essentially, if I've got this loose here, I should be able to move my whole carriage up. Because of the fact that the bottom of this has a pretty snug fit into the bearing, sometimes it's a really good idea to use a little mallet or something to loosen it up. You can tap it in the back, or you can tap it underneath the front here. You just want to tap it to get it loose. There we go. So now it's free and clear. I'm going to take it off now and put it on the bench. So we'll come back to that. This comes up and on the bench. Okay, now that this unit is off, I'm going to remove the top carriage plate because I can't take this out with the top carriage plate in the way. So you need to remove the top carriage plate. So we already took 2 screws out for our wiring harness, so we'll crack these loose. And we'll just remove these and then get that plate out of the way. At this point in time, if you're performing an annual or overdue maintenance on this thing, you can now take these linear bearings and you can clean them. You can take a little bit of rubbing alcohol and wipe out any crud that's inside. You could spray them with brake parts cleaner, but make sure you dry them really well. And then you can come back and you can add a little tiny bit of lubricant onto these. The lubricant we use is called Lubriplate, and this is really good stuff. You can put a thin coating of sewing machine oil if you want on the inside of these, or you can use a Lubriplate. Either or, you just want to get a little tiny bit of lubricant on there so they're not dry. Top and bottom, you can do that. Now I'm going to spin this around so you can see what I've got going on here. I'm going to try and do this so the camera can see it. Okay, so I've got the 3 bolts that are holding in the shaft, and I'm going to take those out. Okay, so now I'm going to carefully pull this out, and that's it. So now to replace this nut, this is a cool thing. This nut, this one's actually really worn, is a 2-piece nut. It has a top piece and a bottom piece, and it's held together by a spring that creates tension on it. I'm going to unscrew this nut off, and I'm going to get a brand new nut, and I'll show you the 2. Now, this is the important part. When you're putting a new lead nut onto the lead screw, we've taken the old one off. We have a new one ready to go. So you want to make sure that the lead screw is really clean. So we went ahead and cleaned this lead screw up with, actually I used electronic points contact cleaner. I like it because it leaves no residue. Whether you use brake parts cleaner or electronic points cleaner, something that gets any of the dirt and oil off of it. So I've got a clean new nut. I'm going to get it started by starting the threads down. Now you'll see, I'm going to start screwing it in like this, but it's a 2-part nut. I've got this part is threaded, and so is the top part, but it's separate from the bottom. So what you do is you coil it to where the spring starts tightening. Now you can see the spring is actually getting tight and the coils are closer together. It's not backwards. That would spread the spring out. You want to tighten the spring. So what this is going to do is it means that the screw is always going to have a portion of the nut putting tension on the thread, so there will never be any slop. So what you need to do is you need to turn this basically to where it stops, start threading the shaft in, and then now I've hit the end and my shaft won't turn anymore. So I'm backing the nut off a little tiny bit, and I just go a little at a time, and now the screw goes through with no trouble at all. That's it. And now, you can see, it's got tension on it, and it's tight. It's not tight, it's just that it's got tension, and there's really no resistance on the screw on the shaft. Okay, now we're ready to, we've got the new lead nut mounted on the shaft. The shaft is still dry, it's not been lubricated yet. We've rolled the lead nut down to approximately the same position the old one was in. So now we're going to insert it again into the bottom carriage plate without tearing it all up. And we're going to put a couple of screws in it. Remember, this position is where our wire loop is going to go. Okay, so I'm going to snug this up. I'm not getting ridiculous with it. I'm torquing it down, but you don't have to go crazy with this. It just has to be snug. Now the next thing I'm going to do, I've got my bearings. I cleaned my lower bearings out and my upper bearings out, and I used a little tiny bit of sewing machine oil to lubricate them. So I'm going to turn my carriage over on its side where I can reach the screws. Actually, I'll show you there. This way you can see it. I'll get two of my screws out. Remember, I left my outer screws off because those were holding my wire ties. So I'm going to orient this with the big biscuits that hold the bearings pointing in, just as it was when I took it out. I'll lay it in here. I'll position it. And I'm going to start with my hands, a couple of these. And snug them up. Okay, now we're ready to lay the carriage back onto the unit. Now again, to do this, I want to make sure, I can't stress this enough, boys and girls, that the upper limit switch be way gone, out of your way, because if you smack that with this carriage coming down, you will snap it in half. So, to get the carriage on, obviously the front part faces you. I've got the top bolt, the top screw on my motor coupler is loose so that my shaft can go down in there. I reach up here and I'll start the studs on here, and I'll start rolling it down again. I'm watching that. There we go. All right, so now it goes down into the bearing and seats. It has a, let me grab another shaft here to show you something. The bottom of this shaft has two journals. One that goes into the clamp that connects to the motor, and another one that goes into the bearing. This bearing rides inside this plate. So when the shaft goes down, you want it to seat in the bearing, and it stops all by itself. Once it's seated, you know it's at its lowest point. Then you check to make sure it's gone into the coupler, and this one has. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten up my screw that connects, that binds my shaft to my motor. I give that a good tighten there, and if you want, you can come in with the small end of the wrench in the front here, like this angle here that I'm on. I turn the shaft so I can clear the plate, and I give it just a little bit of extra torque. You don't have to go crazy on these things, they tighten pretty well. Okay, that's it for replacing the shaft and the carriages. So what I'm going to do now because I'm working in reverse. Essentially, I've got to put that top plate on. So again, the flush part of the bearing is going to be on the very top. The part with the recess goes down towards your shaft. So it goes over the two holes there, and it just slips right over the top of the bearing. So again, it's a journal that goes into the bearing, and then it's threaded. The shaft, let me pull this out. The shaft is threaded inside, and that's where your 1/4-20 button head with a little washer goes in. Now that I've got that in there, I'm going to reach up on my tiptoes here and try and do this without seeing it. Okay, that goes down. I hold the shaft. I give this a little snug, and to where it stops, that's it. Now I'm turning the shaft with the wrench. We're good. At this point, I'm going to start putting my sides in. So I'll put a screw in there, and one here. Now I'm going to also be mindful where, before I bring my side in, where's my limit switch? Because remember, I put this nut in manually. If I do this, I am just below my limit switch. Okay, you want to make sure you're clear of the switch, because if you had this rail a little bit higher, you would hit your switch. So make sure you're down to clear your switch. And I'll get these started. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten these up, and I'm going to tighten these down on the bottom up. Then I'm going to plug in my laptop, and I'm going to show you how to lubricate it. Okay, so I got ahead and put the carriage back in. I put the top plate on. I tightened the bolt going into the lead screw. Of course, the lead nut was already tightened. I put my top plate on. I put my two sides on, connected them. Again, be as mindful as to where this upper limit switch intersected the striker so it didn't hit. I tightened everything up here, tightened these up. Everything is checked and tightened. We're ready to give it a try. I put my wires in. So on the front, I've got my wire loops, got my front plate a little loose. I'm going to move this to fit the camera. I'll finish that up later. When I connect this is important. I'm using, let me close this out. I'm using the latest version of the CamLift software with the fine focusing. It's 2.9.7.1. So this one right now, you have to, before you put the power onto the computer, you have to make sure that your serial cable is connected to the computer and to the controller. That prevents any damage to the motor. Then you can put power to it. Now this one fires the camera through this shutter release cable. So every time it fires the camera, a little green LED will blink in there so you know it's hitting it. Now I'm going to go ahead and fire it for the first time. Now remember, when I put this in, I put the lead screw in by hand. So my limit switch is just a little short from my upper, my striker is a little short from my upper limit switch. So when I first turn it on, it's going to go look for the top. It's going to go into that limit switch before it can stop. So let me fire it up, see what it does. It says initializing will raise the carriage of the P51 to the uppermost position. Continue. I hit OK. Okay, it found the top limit switch. I hit OK. Now, there's my interface. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lubricate the shaft. And the way I'm going to do it, I can use the Lubriplate or I can use this. This is from Helix Linear. It's a linear lubricant. I like it because it's a single-use packet. So I'll open this up. I get a little dab of this to come out. It's translucent white. And what I'm going to do, let me swing this around so you can see the front of it a little easier. I'm going to put a little dab of this, you know, just a little tiny bit. That's all it needs. And I'm going to run that lead screw down. And then I'll put some more on the top running up. So this is now lubricating the lead screw. You don't require a whole lot of this stuff. Now, if I look at the lead screw, it's wet and glossy. Okay, so there's the bottom of the lead screw. Has now stopped. There we go. That's all the way to the end. So I come up here. I can put a little on here too. Now I'll go back up. There you can see. Now this is where my lubricant was. I just want to make sure it goes into the nut. And that's it. That's all there is to it. Now this thing is lubricated and you shouldn't have to mess with it for another year. So that's it. I'm going to tell it to go home. Just into the top. That's it. Any questions? No, just kidding. It's real simple to do this. Now, if you were changing your shaft at the same time you're changing the nut, you may have to loosen this bottom carriage piece to adjust to a different length of a shaft, which brings the whole motor and everything up. But if all you're doing is changing the nut, that's it. It's